Hi, welcome back to geometry. In this lesson, we're going to be using corresponding parts of congruent triangles. Our objective is to use triangle congruents and corresponding parts of congruent triangles to prove that parts of two triangles are congruent. It's essential that you understand if you know two triangles are congruent, then you know that every pair of their corresponding parts is also congruent. So this is where we began this chapter. If we knew two triangles were congruent, we listed all three pairs of corresponding angles and all three pairs of corresponding sides. Now you know 5 ways to prove two triangles are congruent. So if you can prove it using one of the 5 ways, side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, or hypotenuse leg, then you know all of the corresponding, meaning matching, parts of the congruent triangles are congruent. So a key concept here, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or abbreviated, you could say this is Cpctc. So let's use corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. We are given that angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. So ABD is congruent to CBD. That's this angle to this angle. We're also given that BDA is congruent to BDC. Can we prove that these two triangles are congruent and therefore proving that their corresponding parts are congruent? We want to prove this. AB corresponds to CB, so we need to first prove the two triangles are congruent. Well, using reflexive property, we could prove that these two triangles are congruent using angle, side, angle. And therefore, we can prove their corresponding parts are congruent. So let's write the proof. First, it's given to us that angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. Then by reflexive property, we know that BD is congruent to itself. And the last bit that we were given was that angle BDA is congruent to angle BDC. We said therefore we could prove that these two triangles are congruent. Triangle ABD is congruent to triangle CBD using angle side angle. And if you can prove that the two triangles are congruent, then you can prove all of their corresponding parts are congruent. So segment AD is congruent to segment CB using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or Cpctc for short. So this stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Because we could prove that the two triangles were congruent, we can prove that all of their corresponding parts are congruent. We could also prove this, that AD is congruent to CD. We could also prove this, that angle A is congruent to angle C, because all of the corresponding parts of these two triangles are congruent. Let's try another one. We're going to use corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent in order to prove that angle M is congruent to angle R. Currently, we don't know that. What we know is that OM is congruent to ER. That's a side. ME is congruent to RO. That's another side. And they share this third side, and therefore by reflexive property it's congruent to itself. So can we prove that these two triangles are congruent? We can, using side, side, side. And therefore we can prove the two triangles are congruent. And if we can prove the two triangles are congruent, then we can prove the corresponding parts of these triangles are congruent. So angle M is congruent to angle R using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Let's write the proof. Segment OM is congruent to segment ER. That was given to you. Segment ME is congruent to RO. Again, that was given. And thirdly, segment OE is congruent to itself by reflexive property. Triangle OME is congruent to triangle ERO using side, side, side congruence postulate. And because we can prove that these two triangles are congruent, well, then we know that their corresponding parts are congruent. So angle M is congruent to angle R using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or Cpctc for short. If you need to, pause this video and write the proof. We're proving two triangles are congruent and therefore can take it one step further and say, if we know the triangles are congruent, then we know the corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Let's try another. Here we're given that angle SPT, that's this angle, is congruent to angle OPT. We're also given that segment SP is congruent to segment OP. And we know that they share this side, TP. And therefore, can we prove that these two triangles are congruent? We have side, angle, side. So we can prove the two triangles are congruent. And if the two triangles are congruent, then we can prove their corresponding parts are congruent. So angle S would be congruent to angle O. Let's write the proof. Angle SPT is congruent to angle OPT. That was given. Segment SP is congruent to segment OP. Given. Segment TP is congruent to itself, segment TP, by reflexive property of congruence. Now we can say we know enough to prove that triangle SPT is congruent to triangle OPT by side angle side. And if the two triangles are congruent, then all of their corresponding parts are congruent. So angle S is congruent to angle O, because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or Cpctc for short. Last one. You now know that if you can prove two triangles are congruent, then you can take your proof one step further to say you know all of the corresponding parts are congruent. So in this proof, we want to prove that segment CT is congruent to segment RP. That's what we're looking to prove. We don't know it. But can you prove these two triangles are congruent? There's more than one way to do this proof. Why don't you pause this video and take a minute, see if you can write the proof. So you know segment YT is congruent to segment YP. That's given. We also know angle C is congruent to angle R. It's given. And angle T is congruent to angle P. Are these two triangles congruent? We have angle, angle, side. You could have gone on to say that you know this by the third angle theorem or by vertical angles, and you could have done angle, side, angle if you wanted to. But you didn't have to. We were given enough information to prove these two triangles are congruent. And if you can prove them congruent, then you can prove that the corresponding parts of the congruent triangles are congruent. So, this is what my proof looks like. Yours might be a little different, as long as you get to the same result. Segment YT is congruent to segment YP. That was given here. Angle C is congruent to angle R, given here. Angle T is congruent to angle P. This is enough information. You didn't need any more than this. If you took it another step, you didn't need to. But that's okay if you did. You just took a longer route to get there. These two triangles are congruent using angle, angle, side. And therefore, if you can prove that the two triangles are congruent, then you can prove that all of the corresponding parts of these triangles are congruent, using corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, or Cpctc for short. So in today's lesson, we learned that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. We've come full circle. That's where we began this chapter. Was if we knew two triangles are congruent, then we knew all of their corresponding parts were congruent. Then we went on to prove that two triangles were congruent using the 5 ways: side, 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 angle, side, side, angle, angle, side, and hypotenuse leg. And now, if you could have just a minimal amount to prove two triangles are congruent, then you know that all of their corresponding parts are congruent.